Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Day in History. We're taking a little bit of an off ramp from our usual format tonight, where I discuss one event, one person that was born, and one person that died, and the historic context in which the event took place, the historic consequences of it. Because there are two people and two events in American history that had profound effects that occurred on this day, April the 4th, and I want to discuss them in the proper context. One of them occurred in 1841, the other in 1968. They were both deaths, and they had profound consequences. So, let's discuss April 4th, this day in history. And as I said previously, the first event occurred in 1841. On this day, William Henry Harrison dies in office, becoming the first U.S. president to die while in office. Harrison was the ninth president. He had been sworn into office 31 days prior and had developed a cold on the 22nd of March. Now, most people believe that Harrison died of a cold because he got a cold during a driving rain, giving the longest inauguration speech in history without a coat. That is not accurate. And also, modern medical research and scientific peer-reviewed papers have shown that Harrison most likely died of septic shock because of the horrible water treatment that the White House and the city of Washington, D.C. had in 1841. It is also suspected that this led to the death of James K. Polk after he left the White House and the death of President Zachary Taylor and many others in Washington. Washington was a cholera hotbed. But Harrison dies. And we would assume that the vice president becomes president when this occurs. And it is in the Constitution now. But at that time, it was not. And it was less clear what actually happened. People were not really sure. Me and you would assume that the vice president becomes president. And as I said, it is now written in law. But it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't always that way. So what happened was, Tyler immediately assumes command. He says, "I'm president now, and you will address me as such, or you will not. I will not respond. I'm not acting president. I'm not president. Vice president ruling with the consensus of the cabinet. I'm not president until a new election can be held. No, I am president until the end of this term. And I get to decide how I'm going to rule." And he set the precedent until the passage of the 25th Amendment that when a president dies in office, that the vice president becomes president. And this would be the case when Zachary Taylor would die, when Emily Fillmore would become president, Lincoln and Johnson, Garfield, Arthur, McKinley, Roosevelt, Harding, Coolidge, Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson. And it wasn't until the Kennedy assassination that Congress really got serious about codifying this into law. They also cleared up the vacancy that would occur in the vice presidency, because after Harrison died and Tyler became president, there was a vacancy in the vice president. And that was a whole nother area of confusion. What would happen if Tyler had died? I have discussed this in other videos. I discussed it when talking about John Tyler and his death and the explosion on the USS Princeton. But it's another point that you have to consider, because there were times when these accidental presidents became presidents that there was the risk of that occurring. With Tyler, you had moves to impeach him. You had the explosion of the USS Princeton. Johnson, obviously, there's a huge issue there. He was impeached by the House of Representatives and narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate by one vote. Now, if the impeachment had led to the removal of Donald Trump, Mike Pence would have become president. There was no question that would have happened. If the presidential impeachment of William Jefferson Clinton had led to his removal, there was no question Albert Gore would have become president. This was less clear during this time who would have took over. Trust me, there was a pretty clear understanding of who would have become president when Johnson, if he had been removed from office. But as I said, there were times that this could have occurred. Teddy Roosevelt was involved in a very serious automobile accident after the assassination of William McKinley and him becoming president before the next presidential election could occur, and Roosevelt would get his own vice president. So, this was a huge moment with Tyler taking control and setting that precedent in motion. What could have been a constitutional crisis was averted by some quick action by Tyler. Now, Tyler would become a huge disappointment for the Whigs. He would set out on his own course and abandon a lot of Whig policies, and they would deny him the nomination to run for election to a full term of his own. And of course, he would become a traitor to his country when he supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. So, and he's also famous for having a lot of children, and in fact, 2 of his grandsons, yes, I said grandsons, are still alive today, thanks to Mr. Tyler's love of the ladies. He had a second wife that was much younger than him, and had some children very late in life. And those men followed in their father's footsteps. The grandsons have not. So, they're 1968. This is a very sad event in the history of the United States. And it's one of those events that set off just a powder keg. On this day in Memphis, Tennessee, at the Lorraine Motel, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. He was wounded at 6:01 and was pronounced dead at 7:05. Obviously, the King assassination sparked unrest in several major American cities. Walter Cronkite, as he did with most events of the 1960s, broke the news to Americans. He said Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence, was struck down by an assassin's bullet in Memphis, Tennessee tonight. One of the more profound events around the King assassination, though, involves another man that would be assassinated later in 1968, and how he broke the news to an audience. Um, and this man had a very personal experience. Not only would he have a very personal experience later that year becoming a victim of an assassination himself, but his brother had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963. And of course, I'm speaking of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency, um, and he was campaigning in Indianapolis for the Indiana primary. And he landed, and his press secretary told him that he should not go to this event because it was being held in a predominantly African American part of Indianapolis, because Martin Luther King had been killed. Obviously, this was a time before the internet, cell phones, and the massive communications network that we have today. The crowd did not know. And I want to read to you the words that Mr. Kennedy spoke that night. He said, I have bad news for you all, for all our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and justice to his fellow human beings, and because of that, and he died because of that effort. It is a difficult day in this difficult time for the United States. It is perhaps well to ask what kind of nation we are, what direction we want to move in. But the most profound line of this is near the end of it. And I want to get it exactly. He says that it's very likely that Dr. King was killed by a white man. And he says, for those of you who may feel hatred toward all white people, I would like to remind you that my brother was also killed by a white man. And the crowd, Kennedy helped hold that crowd. Yeah. And that was a powerful thing. Because the King assassination set off some of the greatest unrest the United States has seen since the Civil War. But there wasn't any in Indianapolis. Indianapolis was one of the bright spots, one of the few major metros in America that didn't see this just great coming apart, and violence and rioting and anger. Washington, D.C. saw large-scale riots. Baltimore, Chicago, Kansas City, New York City, Detroit. In the immediate aftermath and the days after. But Kennedy helped begin the healing process in Indianapolis, and that is a very noble thing. Obviously, Dr. King would die at a very young age. He would leave behind a widow, children, and those children would go on to honor their father's legacy. by continuing the struggle for civil rights. And Dr. King is honored, of course, with a federal holiday and a monument in Washington, D.C. On the National Mall. And I think we need to teach children that Dr. King is a lot more than one speech. And it's a very sad fact that most children in schools today only know Dr. King because of that speech. They need to be taught more about Dr. King and his message. The message of nonviolence, the message of what he stood for. And I am a firm supporter of the King holiday. And it's amazing to me as a millennial, and the King holiday has always been a holiday since in my lifetime. But there was even a debate, and it was even a controversial issue to make the King holiday. That's just a far out concept to me that anyone could have opposed that. So that's all I have for you tonight. I will see you tomorrow. Sorry that this was a little different diversion than usual, but I felt it was necessary. So stay safe out there, y'all.